Good morning and happy Easter. It's great. You know, Easter means a lot of things. For some of us, that's the day we celebrate Jesus. For some of us, that's the day we celebrate our parents giving us Easter baskets, right? Lots of candy, sugared up. Love it, okay? So today we are talking about Jesus, believe it or not. And just the power that he has in our lives to restore and to resurrect things. I remember when I was training for ministry, I was in my junior year of college and going through my first intensive internship at a church. Now, I chose my internship wisely based on the mere fact of proximity to the church and whether or not they would accept me, okay? Those were my filters for getting into an internship. Will you take me? They took me. Okay, so I got in, and I was learning how to be a youth pastor at the time. And it was a large church. I think it was a church of around 4,000 people. They had a pretty sizable junior high ministry. We had about 120 kids we were ministering to on a weekly basis. So I entered into this youth ministry specifically in the junior high department. And I was learning how to do all sorts of stuff with them. And I was really excited to settle into it and to step into this training. And about 2 weeks after I started my internship, the pastor that hired me in quit. I thought, well, that's fun. Like, so what? Like, who's over me? Who do I answer to? Well, you answer to the lead pastor over students. Okay, that's cool. He quits. And I'm left alone with two other idiot interns. Okay, none of us know what we're doing. And we're doing it really joyfully. And we get about halfway through and realize there's not a whole lot happening. Like, they didn't hire anybody over us. And so we're just still trying to make stuff up as we go along. And there's a couple other volunteers that are leading all this stuff. We're trying to figure it out, but none of us really knows what we're doing. And so they finally hire a new lead over all the family ministries, and he sits down at the end of my internship. And I knew this guy. Like, we had met before, we had some relationship, and he looks at me and he goes, "You really didn't do a very good job." And I thought, hold up, man. It's a good thing you're buying me coffee right now, otherwise I'd be out of here. And I felt those words. I was crushed by them. I thought, I tried the best I knew how. How dare you? Now, at this point, I was already looking at a machine that is the church that needs to be kind of a very well operating kind of a machinery to lead 4,000 people week in and week out. And there were elements of that were really beautiful. And there were elements of that I felt crushed and lost in the midst of the mere fact that I'd say, I don't know what I'm doing, but I didn't know who to tell. I had entered into this internship with so much joy and hope and excitement about doing what God had asked me to do. And in the end, I felt beat up, chewed up, and spit out. And I remember thinking in that moment, as I'm hearing the words, "You didn't do very well," I'm thinking, that's fine, because I'm done. I'm just done with this. I'm done with this position. I'm done with the church, and I'm done with people. Like, that's how I felt. I'm just done. If this is what it is, I don't want any part of it. And I remember over the years, I'd hear many other leaders in church who had kind of echoed some of that same sentiment, but it usually sounded like this: church wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for all the people. Right? Yeah. You laugh at it because you know what that means. You've experienced it. We've all experienced it. And I was feeling that at the end of this internship. And I was feeling right at the edge of the door was this unidentified feeling that in retrospect, I would look back and say, that was cynicism building. It was skepticism and cynicism building. Now, you could help me navigate, and I'm sure fill in the blank for me on some of the things I was feeling. Here, fill in the blank for me on this one. People will always let you down. Yeah. People will always let you down. Some of you were thinking that, but you didn't say it because you're like, I'm not sure we're supposed to say this. It's church. feels wrong. That's our sentiment. Like, people will always let you down. If there's one thing you can expect in life, it's that people will stab you in the back, right? They will let you down. But here's the other thing I've learned. I'm always going to let people down too. Because the reality is, in that internship, I did feel let down, but here's the other thing. I was an idiot. I was immature, inexperienced, and extremely confident. That's a bad mixture, friends. That is a bad mixture. He shouldn't have sat me down and said, you did a bad job at fulfilling your duties. He should have sat me down and said, we're letting you go because you're an idiot. I would have said, that adds up. I've let people down as well. Like, that's the reality of life, is we've kind of come to this place where we expect things out of one another. Last week, we talked about our expectations of Jesus, but this understanding of skepticism and cynicism is really about our expectations of one another and how we let each other down. And sometimes in that, we even let ourselves down. Now, you probably don't even need to look that far back in your story to think about a way that somebody has let you down, or maybe you've let them down, or maybe it wasn't a person. Maybe you had hopes about something being amazing and beautiful and good, and it just didn't pan out the way you expected. Maybe you got to the end of that thing, and you're in your mind, you're thinking, that's not what I thought it would be. Life is filled with those moments. My wife and I have moments that are filled with places and spaces where we thought, that's not what I thought it would be. We had a miscarriage before our first son, and that was hard. I mean, that's hard for everybody. But then we had a child, and then we were like, okay, now it's going to go again. And then after the first child, we tried again and again and again and again. And 7 years later, we're thinking, this is not how I thought it would be. Life is full of those moments. We're not just people, but things seemingly let us down. And over time, we start to build up this wall where we think, you know what, I'm not going to let things or people hurt me anymore. And we call it realistic thinking. Like, if somebody talks to you about it, you're like, no, I'm just being honest, I'm just being real, I'm just being truthful. But at the end of the day, here's what it is. It's cynicism. We're an incredibly cynical culture. Now, Carey Nieuwhof is a leadership expert, and he says this: scratch the surface of most realists, and you will soonly discover that realism is a polite word for cynicism. Why? Because if we recognize that we're cynical, we actually have to deal with the pain that's behind everything that we're thinking. That's not as fun. That's not the thing we were hoping to do or the thing we were hoping to experience in life, and we don't know what to do with those feelings. Now, here's the reality. Cynicism is incredibly difficult because cynical people are not hopeful people. And so what we find ourselves in is being in the midst of a culture that is incredibly cynical and very hopeless. Because we've been shaped by all of these experiences that didn't pan out the way we thought they would. They didn't do what we thought they would do. People weren't who we thought they were. And quite honestly, we failed ourselves and others, and we weren't who we had hoped we would be. When we hit that point, there's a couple of options. One of the options, people push back and they say, I'm just going to be an optimist. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to think positively. If you've ever done that, you realize the limitations to positive thinking. Because the thing still happens, life still falls apart, everything unravels, and you're trying to stay positive, but you're doing it through tears. No, positive thinking doesn't get us there. What we need is restoration. Because positive thinking doesn't change the past. Positive thinking doesn't bring mom back or dad back or the person we lost or the person who abandoned us or the person who left us. Positive thinking doesn't fix the crap that I've done to others or the way that I've failed others or the hopes and dreams that we had that failed. Positive thinking doesn't do that, but restoration can. The problem is, in our culture, restoration is an incredibly rare, if not non-existent thing. Because we don't restore people. We cut them off, we burn bridges, we cancel them, or we write them off. There's only one place we can go for true restoration. I want to invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 26 if you have a Bible. If not, it'll be on the screen. We can all read along. It'll be fun. Matthew 26, we're going to be reading a fair amount of a story. Now, in this story, there's two characters we're really going to hone in on. And one is Jesus and one is Peter. And they tell two very different perspectives on loss, abandonment, and betrayal. Okay? So we start in chapter 26, verses 31 through 35. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. So Jesus is gathered with his closest followers, the 12 people that he had shared 3 years of his life. And scholars believe that 50% of that 3 years was in direct connection. They didn't just know each other for 3 years. They spent a significant portion of time eating together and traveling together and staying in the same place together and doing work alongside one another. And this is the crew that Jesus is gathered with on the night that he was betrayed and he was going to be crucified. Now, they were celebrating the feast of Passover together. And as the meal comes to a close, Jesus ends the meal on a super high note, right? Throwing parties like 101 always end with talk of betrayal. It's awesome. So Jesus gets to the end of the evening and he says, "Hey, I just want to tell you something. This very night, you're all going to fall away on account of me." How do you like that? Then he tells them it's going to be fulfilling a prophecy, but after they do that, he's going to rise, which the disciples aren't quite certain what he means by that. But he says, "After I have risen, I'm going to go ahead of you into Galilee." Now, at this point, it seems like the disciples kind of hear what Jesus is saying and let the second half of it go away, and they focus on the part that is maybe even a little bit slightly narcissistic. They're like, hold up, Jesus. Like, we prophecy, risen, Galilee, whatever. We're not going to betray you. What do you mean fall away? We spent 3 years with you. There were people walking away. You said some really weird things, Jesus, and everybody else walked away from you, but we stuck around. And do you remember this? We had a conversation about this, Jesus. You said, "Hey, are you too going to walk away from me?" And we said, "Well, where else do we have to go?" The same is true now, Jesus. Nothing has changed. We don't have anywhere else to go. We're not going to leave you. And Jesus says, you will leave me. And Peter doubles down. He says, "You know what? Even if everybody else falls away, I'm not going to fall away, even if I have to die." And Jesus says, "You know what? Not only are you going to fall away, but actually, this very night, before the rooster crows, you're actually going to deny me. Everybody else is going to fall away, but you're going to not just abandon me, you're going to deny me. You're going to reject ever having known me." I think that was a difficult moment for Peter. As we see the story progress, they get done with dinner and they leave. Judas gets up and goes what he is supposed to do. The other disciples aren't sure what Judas is doing. They think he's handling money or something, and he's got some business to attend to. But Judas goes away, prepares the mob, and then Jesus brings the rest of his disciples out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's there with the disciples. We pick up in verse 55. There's a crowd outside ready to arrest Jesus, a mob. And starting in verse 55, we read, "In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, 'Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled.'" And then we have a comment from the author, and it says this: "Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." So Jesus is eating with his disciples. He says, you're all going to fall away from me. And they say, no, never. And then dinner gets done. They get up. They take a walk in the cool of the evening in a garden. A mob comes, and guess what? They all walk away. Not days later, not weeks later, not months later, not after some sort of bad events have fallen out between Jesus and his disciples. And they're like, listen, man, you hurt me. I'm just not sure about this anymore. No, it's moments later, they're in the garden, and all of the disciples walk away. They abandon him. They flee. People Jesus had invested significant time in. People that he hand chose. They leave him. Now, you know what the most painful wounds in life are? From the people we love and trust the most. Their words have the power to encourage us more than anybody else, but they also have the power to wound us more than anybody else. No other abandonment, no other betrayal is quite as powerful in our lives as somebody who loves us. And that's exactly what Jesus experiences here. Jesus experienced the abandonment. His disciples, every single one of them, betray him. As we continue on reading, we skip to verse 69. Jesus at this point has been taken from the garden. He's been arrested, and he's been brought in front of the high priest, and then they bring him in front of the governor because they want him killed, but they can't kill him himself. It's not legal for Jews to do, so they pass him on to the Roman authorities, hoping that they'll do something about it. So we read, starting in verse 69, now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. We narrow in now on Peter. Everything Jesus said has happened. All the disciples have walked away. And then we have Peter who said, you know what? Even if everybody else falls away, I'm never going to fall away. And Jesus looks at him and he says, no, not only will you fall away, you'll deny me. And it happens exactly as Jesus said. Jesus has been abandoned by those closest to him. But now we have Peter who is weeping outside the palace, wondering what is happening. Now it's easy to get down on Peter. Right? It's easy to be skeptical toward him. It's easy to judge him in the midst of everything he's going through. But here's what I think might be going on in Peter's mind. He's watching something play out and has no clue what is actually happening. He had traveled for 3 years with somebody he thought would be the salvation of an oppressed people. He gave his life and walked away from his profession and his family to learn the ways of Jesus, thinking that this would be the Messiah that Israel had waited for thousands of years. And then at the end of the Passover meal, when tensions were at their highest for the deliverer of God's people, there is a mob that comes and arrests the would-be Messiah. And Peter watches all of this play out. Now, John gives us a little bit of a different perspective when he writes his gospel. If you read the Gospel of John at this point, there is a moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where Peter pulls out his sword and he strikes the servant of the high priest and cuts off his ear. I'm not sure what he was aiming for, but all he got was the ear. And Jesus rebukes, he comes against Peter. He says, that's not who we are. And he heals the servant's ear and he's arrested. Other than that, there's no sign of struggle from Jesus' disciples. All of these disciples are watching in amazement at what is happening. Wait a second, this is the Messiah, isn't he? Isn't he the one that's supposed to form the mob? Isn't he the one that's supposed to be rallying the troops and charging the palace and taking back our land from the Romans who are oppressing Israel? Isn't that what's supposed to happen? This can't be falling apart now. I think there was something in Peter that was being very self-preservational. as he's answering this servant girl. He answers the servant girl. He says, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm not with them. No, you must be with him. He was surrounded by other Galileans, and you sound like one of those backwoods Galileans with your accent. I'm pretty sure you were with him. No, I don't know the man. I swear I don't know the man. No, I think I saw you with him. I went to one of his teachings, and I saw you. Death should come on me if I'm lying to you. I don't know who you're talking about. I've never met the man. I think there's something that Peter is doing to preserve and keep himself safe, but I think there's also something that is being truthful in the heart of Peter. I think he's watching the whole situation play out, and there's words that are probably coming to his mind, and this can only be guessed and assumed, but I think Peter is looking at this and saying, this is not how I thought this would play out. Maybe he isn't who I thought he would be. Maybe this is all just a sham. Maybe I don't actually know who he is. I thought he was this Messiah, but maybe he's not. Maybe I don't know who he is. I think there's a part of Peter that I can only guess is wrestling with the truth of what just happened. Things are unraveling and falling apart, and he's just trying to make sense of it. And so he watches and he denies. And the rooster crows, and it's like that alarm going off that Jesus warned him about. You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. Over the course of a single night, early in the morning before the sun has even risen, Peter is denied. Jesus continues going on. There's the Jesus before Pilate. He's taken, he's crucified. He's buried in the ground. And all hope seems lost for the disciples. They feel like everything has gone away. Jesus has been abandoned by his followers, but the followers very likely feel abandoned by the would-be Messiah. Things aren't panning out the way they thought they would. They had given up their profession and everything they held dear to follow this man for 3 years and to give him everything they had. How could he do this? How could he? How could he just fail us that way? How could he just let us down? How could he abandon us? We didn't abandon him. He abandoned us when he told us he was something that he wasn't. He's not who he said he was. They felt hurt and betrayed themselves, I would imagine, as they see the stone rolled in front of the tomb of Jesus, and they're still weeping for what they had hoped would be. And they walk away. Now, as you read the story, we understand what happens to Jesus. He's crucified and buried, and he's in the grave for 3 days, and after that, by the power of God, he is raised again. But what happens to the disciples? We can pick up in the book of John as he describes the scene following the resurrection. Now, following the resurrection, there was a couple of eyewitness accounts to Jesus' empty tomb and to the resurrected reality of Jesus. He's shown up to a couple of people, but then as we read through the book of John, we start in John 21:1, and we read this. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, do you have any fish? No, they replied. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. As we continue on picking up in verse 15, the story continues. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time, he said to him, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So we know what happens to Jesus, and now we read what the disciples did. We can see at least a hint of feelings of betrayal and wondering what happened. Did we get this wrong? Was he not who he said he was? You see, this group, we have about 7 disciples here. 4 of them are actually brothers. 2, Simon and Andrew, are brothers. Andrew is likely one of the unnamed disciples. And then we have the sons of thunder, the sons of Zebedee, and they are James and John. And then we have Nathaniel listed and Thomas listed, and then at least one other that's unknown is listed here. And this group of friends, what are they doing? They're fishing. They're fishing. They're doing the exact same thing they did before they met Jesus. Now, they are together, and that's likely because there's a good likelihood that they knew each other before following Jesus. In fact, it seems quite likely that all of them were having come from the same community, knew one another, and had relationship with each other even before following Jesus. Now, they might not have been the closest of friends, they might not have always gotten along, but they were at the very least familiar with each other. And many of them were fishermen. And so it's quite likely that after Jesus is dead and resurrected, there's some other internal thoughts going on in the disciples' minds. Here's what I imagine they're thinking. So Jesus died. Maybe he wasn't who we thought he was. But then some people started talking about him coming back to life. Now, I remember he said some things like that, but I didn't think it would be true. I didn't think it would be literally true. I thought he was talking about rising to power eventually, not coming back from the dead. This doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure what to do about it. And beyond that, even if he is resurrected, even if these eyewitness accounts are true, Jesus isn't going to want us back. We all walked away. Peter's probably thinking, not only did we walk away, I denied him and he knew it. There's no way. No possible way Jesus would ever want us to be his followers. If he is truly resurrected, if everything we're starting to believe is actually true, he's probably going to grab a whole new set of disciples and continue on with the plan, but not with us. And we see the hopelessness in the disciples as they go back, not just to fishing, they go back to their old way of living. They go back to what they knew. It was as if they looked at the last 3 years and they just wiped it off the timeline. Said, you know what, let's just pretend none of that ever happened. Let's pretend that Jesus never called us to begin with. Let's just fish. Let's just do what we know. Let's pretend it didn't happen. And so they go back to fishing, and Jesus comes along. He comes along, interestingly, to the Sea of Galilee. Now, there's a couple of hyperlinks. You know what a hyperlink is? When you're on the interwebs and you have a blue underscored line and you click it and it takes you somewhere else, that's a hyperlink, okay? It takes you to a different page. There's a couple of hyperlinks in this passage as Jesus is meeting with the disciples at the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee is one of those hyperlinks. It's just earlier in the story. You see, when Jesus called Peter and Andrew from their father's fishing business, they were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus was with them, and they pushed out to sea, and Jesus was teaching on a boat. And after he's teaching on the boat, he looks at them and he says, throw the net down on that side. Now, Jesus is a rabbi and he's a teacher. He's a religious leader. He's not a fisherman. And so at this point, Peter, the first time in this hyperlink, he looks at Jesus and he says, all right, Master, we've been fishing all night. And I'm sure that's the shortened version of what Peter said. My guess is Peter said something along the lines of, hey, listen, I understand you're a rabbi, you're a religious leader, you're worth respecting and all that stuff, but this is our job. We caught nothing all night. Do you think that if it was as simple as throwing our net on the other side of the boat, that you don't think we would have tried that? But in the first time, after Peter pushes back, he says something effectively like, well, you know what? I'm just going to give you the benefit of the doubt. At your word, because of who you are, because of your authority, I'm going to do what you say. You'll see for yourself. And when Peter does that, the net can barely be brought up. And he's not even certain what he's seeing, but he sees it as confirmation that Jesus is worth following, and he starts following Jesus at the Sea of Galilee. And now we have Jesus back on the shore of Galilee. We have Peter fishing in the boat, and Jesus looks at Peter, and he calls out. Early in the morning, before the sun has fully risen, he calls out, hey, throw your net on the other side. I think Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. I think he goes into this moment thinking, I'm really going to get him. Like he's going to know exactly what's going on. Jesus gets to the edge of the Sea of Galilee. He's like, I've been here before. I've done this. Throw your net on the other side of the boat. They've been fishing all night, hadn't caught anything, but they still do it. I don't know if they were grumbling or thinking, who is this guy? Who is this guy in the dark on the shore telling us to fish on the other side of the boat? Whatever. Let's just give it a try. And the same thing happens. And John leans over to Peter and he says, it's the Lord. And Peter takes his outer garment, he's just in his undies, right? He's just in his tighties. And he takes his cloak and he wraps it around himself and he dives into the water. Now, again, we have another hyperlink here. There's a moment in time where Jesus was walking out to the disciples on a sea and it was rough. And the disciples were all scared and Peter was with them. And they saw this figure walking out to them on the water. And Peter and the other disciples are getting really panicked. They're like, this is a ghost. This is terrifying. There's a ghost walking toward us. And then Jesus calls out to them. And they're like, oh, it's the Lord. But is it? What is he doing? He's on the water. I don't know what's going on. And Peter calls out to him back and he says, if it is you, call me to walk to you. He tests him. There's a level of propriety here as well. Peter is like, you know what? If you are the Lord, test me and call me out onto the water. And that's the moment that we see Peter get out of the boat and he walks momentarily on the water toward Jesus, but not this time. This time there's no pretense, there's no testing, there's no dignified speech or action. Peter, almost naked, wraps his cloak just around his waist and dives into the water. Doesn't ask Jesus, hey, if this is you, call me out on the water, call me to you. He just knows this is the Lord and I'm not wasting another moment. I need to be with him. For whatever I can, for whatever it's worth, I need to be with him again. And so Peter dives in. The other disciples we see, they bring all the rest of the fish. If you continue reading the story, there's 153 fish in this net that they pull. Now, these boats are small. The nets are relatively small. It's a lot of fish to pull in. We see that they're only about 100 yards away. So Peter dives into the water. The rest of the disciples, probably murmuring at Peter for not helping out, are towing the rest of the fish into shore. And they find Jesus there as the sun is rising just a little bit more. And they see that Jesus has built a fire and he's just waiting for their fish. Now, at this point, I'm reading the story and I'm like, Jesus might not have been recalling to mind what he's done with them before. Maybe he's just hungry. He's like, I got the fire. Where's the fish? I'm going to let them do it for me. But they bring in the fish and Jesus cooks it and they eat it. And we pick up on the story. After they had finished eating, Jesus looks to Simon Peter. Are you catching this pattern that Jesus likes to have significant conversations after you're full? That should just be wisdom to us. Don't deal with anybody when they're hangry, okay? Feed them first and then have the hard conversation. So Peter is full, Jesus is full, and they're sitting on the shore. And I think the other 6 disciples are just leaning back thinking, man, this is good. Like, do you remember, like we used to do this all the time. And I think Peter is probably just a little bit off to the side. And I think his face is just a little bit down. And I think Jesus comes over to him and he says, hey, Peter, do you love me more than these? Again, this is a hyperlink to a passage we just read. Do you remember when Jesus said, everybody's going to fall away from me? And Peter said, not me. Everybody else might, but not me. I don't think Jesus is asking Peter to compare himself to anybody else's love. I think Jesus is asking Peter to remember the claim that he himself made. Do you love me more than all these? It's not comparing his love to somebody else. It's asking him to recall in his mind the fact that he had failed. He said, if everybody else falls away, I'm not going to fall away. And then Jesus looks at him and he says, hey, do you remember all of these? You remember what you said about that? I think Peter realizes that a little bit, but maybe not willing to deal with it quite yet. And Peter responds, yeah, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus responds again, feed my lambs. Now, shepherds, they were oftentimes not just literal shepherds. It was viewed as the spiritual leaders of Israel. They were often referred to as shepherds. And so this meaning that Jesus gives Peter is significant. He says, feed my sheep. Be a shepherd to God's people. Now, at this point, I think Peter is a little bit confused. Jesus, you know what I did. You know where I've been. You know not only that I've failed you, but I'm pretty sure I was thinking about you failing me. You want me to be a shepherd to your people? Jesus responds, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Again, take care of my sheep. And the third time he says to him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? But this time Peter doesn't just respond. This time it's all clicking together. And I think Peter finally feels that feeling that he had been running from. He ran from it when he went back to his old way of life. He ran from it when he thought Jesus wasn't who he thought he was. And now it's all flooding back in a single moment. And he's hurt by Jesus' third question, because it lines up perfectly with the 3 denials that he himself gave not long ago. And so Peter feels the pain, he feels the hurt, and he knows that Jesus is calling back out of him the story of his own failure. And he can only say, Lord, you know all things, you know I love you. And I think at this point, Peter's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince Jesus that in spite of his failures, he loves him. Here's the thing we need to grab hold of. There's a lot that's going on in this passage, but the most beautiful thing about this passage is not that a dead person is alive and talking to Peter again, but that this person who was dead and is now alive again has the ability to bring that new resurrection life into somebody else's story. In a world that is void of restoration from past failures, from hurts, from disappointments, from missed hopes and deferred hope, from all of these things, Jesus brings his resurrection life into it, and he resurrects Peter's story. He restores Peter. You see, forgiveness gets us kind of this blank state of being. Forgiveness gets us to the point where we can kind of have a blank slate and move forward. But that's not what Jesus gives Peter. He doesn't just give him forgiveness, he gives him restoration. Forgiveness brings us back to that 0 point, but restoration brings us so much farther. It takes everything that's broken and it literally changes our perception, at the very least, of the past. Jesus knew Peter's whole story. And what I love about the restoration of Peter isn't just that they get together and Jesus looks at Peter, he's like, you good? Peter's like, yeah, I'm good. You good? Yeah, I'm good. And then they move on. Jesus leads Peter through experiencing every bit of failure in their recent history. Jesus knows Peter's story thoroughly, and he can retell it. And he doesn't just forgive it, he restores it, he redeems it, and he commissions Peter to be a leader. Not just brings him back and says, you know what, you failed, but if you start at the bottom, you can work your way back up. It'll take you a while, but you can do it if you're dedicated. He restores him and he puts him into a place of leadership over God's people. That's the kind of restoration that Jesus offers. That's the significance of resurrection life. We don't celebrate just because somebody was dead and he came back to life. We celebrate because in him, our failures and those who have failed us were nailed to a cross with Jesus, and now we're not just brought back to a clean slate. We are restored and brought beyond anything we could ever imagine, because that's the power of Jesus. Here's what we catch about Jesus. Here's the truth that I really want you to hold on to. Is that just as the resurrection of Jesus, just as Jesus was resurrected from the dead, he resurrects our hopes. We see it in Peter's story. Peter was hopeless. He was a betrayer and felt betrayed, but Jesus resurrected his hope. Jesus knew when he called all of his disciples that they would fail him. And out of anybody in all of Scripture that should be cynical and jaded against human behavior, it should be Jesus. But he chose it anyway. He chose it anyway. He chose them anyway. And then we have Peter, who is the betrayer. He's the denier. The one who felt like all of his hopes and dreams had come unraveled and that God had let him down. How could he? And he receives the resurrection life of Jesus. His hopes, everything that he could have dreamt of, it's alive again. In a new and a powerful way. You see, that's what Jesus' resurrection does for us. It takes us from a place of hopelessness and jaded cynicism to a place where we can hope again. It's not just about forgiving you because you're a rotten person. See, here's what I'm convinced of. Jesus doesn't come for rotten people. He comes for those he loves. And I think when we grasp hold of this, we can start to change some things that we feel and see around us. We can start to shape a world that is shaped by cynicism and jadedness and hurt and betrayal and abandonment. We can be shaped by the truth of the resurrection in our own lives, and we can hope again. Again, leadership expert Carey Nieuwhof says this: of all people on earth, Christians should be the least cynical. After all, the gospel gives us the greatest reasons to hope. Some of you have had a story that's shaped by letdown, betrayal, and hurt. The gospel this morning calls us to hope again. And it offers us a way forward to hope, to trust, to healing, to being alive. See, that's what cynicism does, is it feels like a death in our own soul. But all it is a bad attempt at protecting ourselves from more hurt. Jesus doesn't want to protect you from more hurt. He wants to heal it and bring you to a better place. That's the hope of the resurrection. That's the power of the gospel. Now, I want to give us a few ways, a few things we can think of so that we can all know hope again and feel it revived in us. And the first thing that I want you to remember is this, that Jesus knows your story. Jesus knows your story. Just as he knew all the disciples' stories and he could retell and replay those stories with them, just as Jesus knew all the disciples' stories and he chose them anyway, Jesus knows your story. And here's the beautiful thing: nothing catches him off guard. So I know some of us are going through some intense stuff in life right now, and we might not even be processing it all, but here's what I just want to ask you to do this morning. I just want to ask you to close your eyes and take a deep breath with me. Don't forget to let it out. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Jesus knows exactly what you've gone through, what you're going through, and what you will go through. Nothing catches him off guard. Jesus wasn't surprised at the betrayal of his disciples. He wasn't surprised when they walked away. He wasn't surprised when Jesus was denied by Peter, and he's not surprised when others hurt us or we hurt others. It doesn't surprise him. He's not caught off guard by this. He's not biting his godlike nails saying, what am I going to do? He sees you and he knows you, and here's the beautiful thing, he's choosing you anyway. He knows your story. The second thing I want you to remember is this. He doesn't just know your story, he will restore you. Jesus will restore you. He knows you, so the good news is you don't have to hide your story, and he restores you. He doesn't just know it and have no power over it. Jesus knows your story and has the power to enter into it and restore it. And here's how Janine and I, my wife, if you haven't met her name's Janine, she's awesome. And we do some stuff, some ministry together that helps people move past hurts and pains in their lives. And here's the beautiful things that we've gotten to see. We've gotten to see Jesus enter into painful memories of abandonment, betrayal, and trauma, and we've seen the resurrection life of Jesus enter into those memories and heal them. In that sense, the resurrection of Jesus has the power over your story, not just to restore it, but to literally change your perception and experience of it. That's about as close as you can get to changing the past. The resurrection of Jesus is timeless, and it changes our past because it restores it and it redeems the hurtful and painful memories. It restores back to hope the hopeless and dry areas. It gives us life and vitality when we thought all was lost. When we hit a situation we think that's not how I thought it would pan out, Jesus wants to restore that. That's the power of the resurrection. The third thing I want to challenge us all into is if we can be confident that Jesus knows our story and that he will restore us, then we can live with grace toward one another. Truly, we can live with grace toward one another. Here's the thing that captures me about Jesus' story with Peter, is he knew all of these things would happen. And if anybody had the right to look at Peter and say, I told you so, better luck with your next rabbi, Jesus isn't even upset. I think some of us have this idea that Jesus is mad at us until we can get it right. Here's the bit of good news is that Jesus doesn't expect you to get it right. If he did, he wouldn't have needed to come himself. Jesus had always planned on restoring you. Not on keeping you from making the mistakes, not on keeping other people from making mistakes, but on restoring them and redeeming them and making something not just the same, but with a clean slate, something better. And so in light of that, we can live with grace and mercy toward one another, just as Jesus knows our story. And isn't upset, he's not caught off guard by it. We don't have to be caught off guard by other people's brokenness. That's the good news. You and I, we don't have to be caught off guard by other people's brokenness. Now, without restoration, that's cynicism. Without the resurrection, believing that people will hurt you before they do, that's cynicism. Believing that things won't go as you had planned and that the world will fall apart just when you least expect it, that's cynicism. But with the resurrection of Jesus, it's restoration and true expectancy that, things are going to go south. Life is going to happen. People will let you down, and you will let other people down. But here's what you can expect. The resurrection of Jesus will meet you in those moments every single time. And so we don't have to be caught off guard by other people's mistakes and failures and abandonments. We are free to no longer hold on to those things, but to truly let them go. You see, I'm not sure we can fully accept the resurrection life of Jesus while we still hold on to the injustices we feel from life and from other people. Because in that, we're still saying that the resurrection of Jesus isn't enough. I need the resurrection of Jesus, and I need the apology from that person, and I need that person to make right their wrong when Jesus doesn't expect that from us. The good news is that because Jesus restores us, you can let him have his way in other people's lives and let him worry about their restoration. You don't have to anymore. And we can become some of the most gracious people in the world, where we have an expectancy that people are going to let us down, but instead of meeting it with cynicism, we can meet it with grace and mercy and forgiveness. Of all people in the world, those who have met the grace and mercy and forgiveness of Jesus should be doling it out like Pez dispensers. It's not how a Pez dispenser works, but not quite as effective. We should be doling it out like parades throwing candy. We should just be offering it freely, understanding, this is going to be hard, but because of the resurrection of Jesus, I don't have to let it affect who I am, and I can let Jesus deal with your sin just as he deals with my sin. That's the power of Jesus' resurrection. That's what's available to us. That's what we celebrate today. Now I want to invite you to close your eyes with me. And I want to ask you just to reflect on what Jesus is speaking to your heart today. Would you just imagine that he is standing on the shores of your disappointments and failures, and he's calling out your name this morning? What is he calling to mind? What is he calling to attention in you this morning? Where does he want to bring resurrection life? Where does he want to restore? What does he want to do in you today? Now, would you just imagine yourself diving in the water and meeting him on the shore and feeling his embrace and welcome home? Not restoration to a clean slate, but restoration to a better position. If you've never welcomed Jesus for the first time, I want to invite you to do that this morning. If you've never said yes to Jesus, if you've never asked him to be Lord of your life, to heal your hurts and pains and disappointments, if you've never asked him to forgive you of your wrongdoings, I want to give you an opportunity to do that this morning. And so we're going to do something. I'm going to count to 3. And on 3, if you need that this morning, if you want to invite Jesus into your heart this morning for the very first time to be Lord of all you are, I just want you to stick up your hand, and then we're going to pray together. So as we all just continue with our eyes closed, I'm going to count to 3, and if you feel the Lord stirring in your heart, just shoot that hand up this morning. 1, 2, 3. Would you just raise your hand? Yeah. There's a few up. Some of you might have been hesitant. You're not sure you're ready for it yet. But Jesus is still standing on the shore, and he's welcoming you. He's calling to you. It's not too late. Put that hand up. Still with eyes closed, let's all just enter into this prayer, whether you're praying it for the first time or you're praying it with others this morning. You can pray the simple prayer and invite Jesus to be Lord of your life. Jesus, I've made mistakes in my own heart, and I welcome you to be Lord of my life. I invite you to heal and restore everything that I've experienced, and to take me to a better place with you. I receive your forgiveness and confess you as King. In Jesus' name, amen. We want to celebrate with you this morning. If you prayed that with us, I'd love to pray over you following the service. Come up, be prayed for, and let us help welcome you into a new life with Jesus. We can be the most gracious people in the world, but we have to feel that inside first. We have to know that inside first. Let's continue celebrating this morning.